Hey guys, I've been thinking a lot about the fretboard lately and maneuvering around it in easy ways to memorize all these different locations. Instead of memorizing 5 basic pentatonic scales and then trying to fit them together into making this big thing on the fretboard that looks an awful lot like that. Which, if you memorize all the boxes and everything, you will get that. And it's not a bad thing, but different people learn different ways, and I've just kind of stumbled on something. I kind of noticed it in the fretboard logic book, but I didn't see it quite explained this way. So I'm going to show you a few patterns that are recurring in several places. So they're very predictable, and then the relation of that pattern to the next pattern is predictable, and it's there every time. And it's a matter of learning 4 different patterns with 4 notes each and learning them in 3 different places. And so what I will do is I'm going to show you that here. Let's see how it goes. And something I have noticed in looking at this is there's basically 4 different shapes that occur over and over again in this pentatonic scale. And I've come up with some names for these things. I'm calling this shape, which you probably recognize. You see it on the 1st and 2nd string in the base of box 1 of the blues pentatonic scale that you probably learned, probably the first thing you ever learned when you were learning how to solo. The rectangle will always have attached to it a square. Now the rectangle is 2 notes on adjacent strings separated by 2 frets. The square is 2 notes on adjacent strings separated by 1 fret with 2 more notes. And you will always find, and the reason I'm starting with this rectangle, because there's a really cool pattern. We're just going to talk about right off the bat the 3rd and 4th string, because these sit nicely on my neck here. You'll notice that every time you have a rectangle, which will show up in the scale, every time, without exception, you'll have a square attached to the back end. You'll have a square attached to the front end. We'll go ahead and leave those pink dots there. So no matter, whenever you have a rectangle, you'll have a square, you have a square. What's interesting, I just noticed this, I should have noticed this years ago. What you'll find after you have a rectangle and a square is they're bracketed by what I'm calling the trapezoid, because it has kind of this trapezoidal shape. The trapezoid will be attached to the square. There's another trapezoid attached to this square. So now what we have is rectangle, square, trapezoid. This trapezoid always fits the other trapezoid. So when you continue down the neck this way, you'll find the other trapezoid attached to it. And attached to the trapezoid will be a square. Attached to the square will be the rectangle. Attached to the rectangle will be another square, and so on that way for eternity. Same thing that way. When you have the rectangle, you have a square attached to it. Attached to the square is the trapezoid. Attached to that trapezoid is the other trapezoid that dovetails into it, and so on that way for eternity. So depending on if you got a little guitar with a small neck like mine or 24 frets, if you take those shapes, on the 1st and 2nd string you'll find that same pattern. You'll find on the 3rd and 4th string you'll find that same pattern. And you'll find on the 5th and 6th string that same pattern. So it'll make it a lot easier to get out of playing in the boxes when you know where you can predictably go in either direction. So real quick, we'll review the 4 shapes.
The rectangle, remember, is always bracketed by a square, one on each side of it, which will make the square having the rectangle on one side and one of the trapezoids on the other side. Now the trapezoids, there's two different trapezoids. You'll have the square will be on one side and the other trapezoid on the other side. Now look at how the rectangles relate to each other on the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth strings, as well as how the squares also have a relationship to each other on those same strings. You'll also find the trapezoids the same thing. The spacing to each other are the same with all the shapes on those respective strings. Alright, so last but not least, taking what we've learned so far, we're going to go ahead and dress out this this fretboard here. We'll throw our nut in here. 5th fret is right here, and our 12th fret is right there. And we're going to first off lay down our rectangles, because that's the first shape I talked about. And on this particular one, I've done this in advance so that it'll lay out. I'm going to start on the 5th fret and throw our first rectangle down, which of course, if you remember the pentatonic scale that you probably learned very first in A, that's where those two would be. Then taking the diagram I showed you with the relationships of the rectangles, I'm going to go ahead and just throw all of my rectangles down right off the bat, and you'll see, at least for me, the rectangles, actually that's the first shape I actually noticed, and then I realized that all this other stuff was attached to it. So that's why I'm starting with the rectangle. You may see squares, you may see trapezoids. These two notes represent open strings, so we've got our first rectangle, our second rectangle, our third rectangle, and remember, here's our first and second string. Attached, bracketing that first rectangle, will be a square and a square, and then bookending those will be our trapezoids, trapezoid and trapezoid. So we have our rectangle, squares, trapezoids. Okay, and those two trapezoids fit each other. We'll dress this one out. Rectangle, square, square, open tuning. We'll do our trapezoid, and remember this trapezoid will fit right in there. Trapezoid. Then we have this rectangle on the 5th and 6th string, has a square attached to it, has a trapezoid attached to it, the other trapezoid attached to it, of course has a square. Now that was really fast, and look what we've just accomplished. Remember our pentatonic box in A, that first one you ever learned? Then you'll notice that right next to it is that box. Right next to that is that box. If you've studied the boxes all, you'll see these things just pop right out. There's a box there and a box there, all in the key of A. So you'll see that by using just a little bit of few recognizable shapes, sticking them together, you're able to throw them down, and you'll be able to break out of the boxes by moving up and down to an adjacent square or adjacent trapezoid, and it just kind of blends together. So hopefully that was helpful to you guys, and that's just kind of how I've been seeing it lately.